When you get your budget routine set up, you might feel really great. There's a lot of motivation, there's a lot of excitement, and then you hit a month where you overspend. If you aren't sure what to do when this happens, this episode is going to help you because I'm going to share a few tips on what to do when it happens and also a few tips on how to avoid overspending in the first place. Are you ready to stop the chaos, the stress, the overwhelm that's filling your life? I'm Renae Matt, and together you and I are going to build simple routines that are going to change your life. When you put these habits into practice, you're going to be able to organize your life in a way where you can be there for your family, pay off your debt, save money, your house can stay organized, you don't have to stress about what's for dinner, and you still get time for yourself. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to the Routine Advantage Podcast. Now, for some people thinking about a budget routine and overspending in certain categories, the easy answer would be to just say, well, just don't overspend, stay within your limits. But we do know that life happens and things come up that are out of our control. And sometimes we just choose to overspend because that is just the mode we're in. And I know that I am guilty of this. And my husband and I both go through this. And we go through spurts where we're really, really good and we are staying on budget. And then all of a sudden we hit this wall where it just you have this desire to just spend money, and we've got like a bunch of things in the Amazon cart, and it's things that we don't even need. It's just things that we've been browsing, and it's gadgets that look cool. And all of a sudden, it's just like, oh my gosh, I want to just spend money. It does not matter what it's on. I just want to spend money. And we both have these moments, and we talk to each other about it, and we both talk about how annoying it is. But there are times where we do go over our budget in certain categories. And when this happens, you have to know what to do. I mean, ultimately, the goal is to not go over. And as you get really used to your budget routine, you will start to learn your triggers, you'll start to learn your patterns and what motivates you to stay within budget. And the more you are able to stay within your budget, then the more you want to stay within your budget because you can see the progress being made. But every once in a while, you're going to have a month where you overspend in a category because nobody is perfect 100% of the time. So there's going to be a time where you run into this, and rather than letting it totally derail you and make you feel like you just aren't cut out to keep a budget, this is a way that you can kind of get back on track where you can reset and move forward and just continue making progress and continue on with your budget routine without feeling like you just have to throw in the towel because you screwed it up. So that's not the case. So a few first tips that I want to go through is what happens if you do go over. So, number one, you need to balance where the funds are coming from when you go and overspend in a category. So, if you have not built your budget yet and you're like, I don't know what to do with a budget routine, I do have a few episodes that I can share with you really quickly. So, in episode 7, I talk to you about building a base budget. And then in episode 16, it talks about once you have your base budget set up, this is what you do with it. And everybody is going to budget a little bit differently. We learned through Dave Ramsey's baby step program. It's the 7 baby steps, and that is what we used to get out of debt and to learn how to budget and to start building our savings and building a retirement and all of that stuff. I highly, highly recommend that program, and it is free to go through. There are so many resources online, and I believe the website is just ramseysolutions.com, and it is just absolutely amazing and life changing. So if you have any desire to go through something like that, I highly recommend it. But when you are setting up your budget, basically what you're doing is you're taking your income and then you are totaling that, and then you are taking your expenses and you're totaling that, and then you're subtracting the expenses from the income and seeing how much you have left over. Whatever is left over, then that gets applied to your debt or your sinking funds or your savings accounts, however it works in your, particular situation. If you don't have any left over, that is where you start tweaking either your income or your expenses. You either need to, sell some things, pick up some side jobs to increase your income, or or you could do both. You can decrease and start cutting expenses and editing where you're spending your money so that it can balance out. And this allows you to really plan ahead so that you are preparing for the month ahead rather than being reactive when you have expenses coming up and then all of a sudden you are short on money. That is extremely stressful. And we did that for many years in our marriage before we finally caved and started a budget because we were so incredibly broke. And we could not believe how much difference it made, or how much of a difference it made in the stress levels of managing your money ahead of time and planning ahead. It is so incredible how much of a difference it makes. And it allows you to really think through where your money is going to go so that you can actually get ahead. And it just makes such a difference. But when you are putting all of those expenses down, you might think of those as categories. So some of them might be actual bills, and each of those would be just under, monthly bills. But then you have these categories like groceries, dates and social life, maybe gas or like fuel for your car. Maybe it is like charity and church funds. Maybe it is gifts for the month if you have a lot of birthdays in your family every month, something like that. It might be kids' activities or sporting activities, all these different things and categories that you have in your monthly budget will change month to month, or they could remain the same, but they're going to be different for you than they are for me. We probably don't have a budget that looks exactly the same. So when I talk about categories, I'm talking more about like these um, bigger categories that encompass a lot of purchases, like the groceries, like the dates and social life, things like that, that will have lots of purchases under the same category rather than just, like your electricity bill, which is just a one-time thing that month. That's not so much what I'm talking about, but it can go either way if you are overspending in certain areas. If you can just balance it out. So the first thing that you need to do is you just need to balance where those funds are coming from. So for example, if you go over by, say, $200 in your grocery budget, then because you balanced everything ahead of time, you planned ahead of time, you were at a zero base budget, and everything was accounted for, if you go over by $200 in groceries, that $200 has to come from somewhere else. Otherwise, you go into debt. And we don't want that. So, what you need to do is you need to figure out where you can pull that $200 from. If this is a budget that we are doing, if we go over groceries, a lot of times that will come out of our dates and social life budget. And so that gets dropped down and we put that amount into groceries, and then we will have to have less money spent on dates and social life that month. But if you say have $150 in car repairs that come up that you weren't prepared for, then it might be that you want to pull $150 from your grocery budget. And then you know that because you have less money going into your grocery budget, then you need to get really scrappy on trying to use up what's in your freezer and your pantry and planning those meals ahead of time so that you can stay under budget in your grocery budget to account for that extra 150 that you had to put into the car. So it's things like that that you want to do. And when you have your base budget made up and then you go in and you're starting to track these things, if you are not used to budgeting yet, it sounds confusing, but I can assure you that once you start doing this, you will quickly catch on and start to understand what patterns you have. And if you are consistently going $200 over your grocery budget, then you know that either you need to account for an extra $200 just monthly and up your grocery budget, or you need to get a little bit better about planning ahead and planning those grocery lists and not doing so much, spur of the moment or just grabbing things on the go when you're in there. If it's not on the list, don't put it in the cart. And that might be something that would help you too. So once you start seeing this pattern over and over, it will start to help you recognize those patterns so then you can make those changes. So the second thing I would say to do is actually not a tactical thing to do. It is more of an encouragement thing to do. It's to not give up and just keep trying because when you overspend in a category, it can be really discouraging and it can kind of feel like you just don't want to budget anymore because it's stressful to see the number go over and then you have to, recalculate and balance it out and try and figure out where it's coming from. But the encouragement here is that if we weren't keeping track, then that is very possible that you would have gone over anyway, or even further over because you're not tracking it. And then it would have become something that you didn't have the money for, and it would have gone on a credit card. And then that becomes debt. And eventually, if this keeps piling up, 4 months down the road, you are still paying for groceries that were eaten 4 months earlier. So it really is something that can make such a big difference. And even though we have the months where we go over budget, don't let that discourage you and have you give up on your budget routine. Just keep trying because none of us are perfect. And the more we do it, the more practice we will have and the better we will become. And it, even just a little bit each month that you can stay in control, it makes huge progress. So just keep trying. Like that's what I can say to you is don't quit, just keep trying. But I also wanted to share with you some tips that will help you to avoid overspending in the first place because ultimately we would love to stay within budget because then it just dampens that stress level even more. So, number one, you just plan ahead as much as possible. So, that is the big key. If you take anything away from this, it is planning ahead as much as possible. And tip number two here is to always plan for your month in the month prior. So always try to plan for the month ahead before it starts. That makes such a big difference because if you wait until the month begins and then something happens because life gets busy, all of a sudden you might find yourself a week into the month and you still haven't made plans for the month. And then you have overspent in certain things because life keeps going on. And then you might have, forgotten any bills that needed to be paid in that first week and it can just be kind of a nightmare. So, making sure that you take time to plan out your monthly budget ahead of time before the month begins can make a really big difference in helping you be really successful in staying within budget. Tip number three here is to make sure you set up sinking funds. And if you need a refresher on what sinking funds are and some ideas on what types of sinking funds to use, go back to episodes 32 and 85. Those will be super helpful for you in setting up sinking funds. But basically, in a short version of it, is you are taking a category and you are setting a little bit of money aside each month or each paycheck to plan for something in the future. So, like I mentioned, that example of the car repairs that came up that threw your budget off, that was $150 that you could have had set aside in a sinking fund. So, let's say you have a sinking fund that you're plugging, $25 a paycheck into this car repair and maintenance fund that may have had a good chunk of money in it. If you're setting aside $25 for every paycheck, eventually you aren't going to need it. And so it just builds, builds, builds until you do need it. And so if you have $150 set aside in that sinking fund, when that $150 car repair came up, you could have just pulled it from that sinking fund and it wouldn't have thrown off your budget. And then you just continue on and you keep plugging away money in there. And it just is kind of that safety net for things that you know will come up, but you just don't know when. So it's a little different than an emergency fund. But sinking funds will be super, super helpful for you when you have these unexpected expenses, especially if you find that you have them often. The fourth tip is to over budget rather than under budget if you aren't sure what to budget. So this goes for both expenses and income. So if you don't have the same paycheck every time, and it goes up and down, then what you want to do is you want to budget as if it is your lower paycheck. So, giving an example, let's say it's always around, say, $2,000. So let's say you have some checks that are maybe $1,800 and you have some checks that are, $2,400. What you would want to do is you would actually want to budget for the $1,800 because that would be the minimum income that you know that you can like depend on. And so you would plan out your monthly budget with that $1,800. And then if your check is bigger, then you have more wiggle room to then add the additional funds into your budget somewhere, whether it's going and applying it to debt or putting it into your sinking funds or into your emergency fund if you haven't built that yet. But there's a lot of different things you can do with excess money. It's a lot easier to have excess money than to plan for 2,400, but then your check is only 1,800, and then all of a sudden you need to figure out where that $600 that you budgeted is now coming from because you're $600 short. So that is a really big tip I have is to make sure that you are or over budgeting for that, and because, or I guess that would be under budgeting. I need to figure out my wording here. So if it's income, you are under budgeting. You're going with the minimum because then you can have excess. But with expenses, you want to over budget. So for expenses, for that example, would be like, say you have a let's say an electricity bill. We were talking about electricity before. Say you have an electricity bill that isn't always the same. It goes up and down because a lot of electricity bills do. I think all of them might. I guess I don't know for sure. But if you have an electricity bill that is, some months it's 150 and then some months it's 250, then I would recommend that you budget for 250 because then again, if it ends up being 150, you have an extra $100 to spare. Where if you budget for 150, but then your bill comes in at 250, then again, you need to pull $100 from somewhere else because you are now short $100 to pay that bill. So if it is income, you are under budgeting. If it is expenses, you are over budgeting. That is the way to say that. And then tip number 5 here is to just say no more often. And this is one that I'm telling myself this as much as I'm telling you this. It is a hard one. We are living in a world where convenience is so easy and convenient. Shocker. But we can order absolutely anything within seconds of thinking about it. And when we are in those moods to spend money and to try new things and to try new products, and something looks cool or looks like it might make our life a little bit easier, or it's, some new shoes or new clothes, it is so easy to just spend money very, very quickly and it adds up very quickly. So, what we want to do is we want to make it a habit to say no more often. And one trick that I do myself, and Tony does this too, is we used to just go on Amazon or wherever we were shopping, and we used to just see what we wanted and we would plug it into the cart, and then we would just check out because we were just thinking about it we at that moment, and we would just check out, and all of a sudden we would have these packages coming and it's like, why did I order this? Oh, that's right. Like, it was always regret later because we didn't actually take the time to think it through, where now it is way more of an intentional thought to purchase certain things. So we will not necessarily just say no right off the bat, but we will put it in the cart and then we let it sit there. And we don't buy it right away. We let it sit there. Sometimes it's overnight, sometimes it's for weeks, and we just keep letting it sit in the cart until we have had time to really think it through and to decide if a few days later if we actually still want it. Because more often than not, we go back to the cart and then we just hit the button that says save for later and it drops it out of our cart and we totally forget about it because we don't actually need it. It was going to be an impulse purchase. And if once we made the habit of putting it into the cart and then leaving it be, we would go back and see all of these things that in our old days we would have just purchased. And we have saved all this money because we are much more intentional about what we actually need and what we actually want to purchase and where our money is going. So, if you have a tendency to be an impulse shopper, that is a huge one, is to just have a habit of saying no more and to put things in the cart, but make sure that you are waiting a certain period of time before checking out so that you can actually take some time to think about it and see if it's actually a purchase that you want to make. So, hopefully, I was able to explain this a little bit more easily for you so that a budget routine isn't scary or doesn't sound overwhelming. We want this to be a practice that becomes habitual and actually reduces the stress and helps you reach your goals much faster than you would without a budget. So, hopefully, this was helpful for you and encourages you that even if you have months where you are overspending, this is a way to help you get back on track and then also practices that you can do that will help you to stop overspending in the first place. But either way, just keep going, don't give up, and happy budgeting. Did you love that episode or learn something useful? If so, would you do me a huge favor? My goal is to grow this podcast and help as many women as I can break free from the overwhelm so they can truly enjoy their life. The best way for me to do this is for you to leave a 5-star written review on your podcast app and to share this episode with a friend or in your Instagram stories. I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next episode. Take care.